Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so I think I'm just going to start things. I'll say a few words and I'll let people trickle in. I wanted to welcome everyone to the spring season finale of the Woods Hole Science and Technology Educational Partnership, WHSTEP, Lab Dates. If you haven't already checked out WHSTEP's website, there's a lot of opportunities there for the general public to get involved and see what science is happening in Woods Hole. We typically, in a non-pandemic time, we have family science nights and offer talks. We're hopefully going to continue these lab dates. It's also an opportunity for us to connect scientists with the local schools. WHSTEP's a network that is comprised of the research institutions here in Woods Hole and the regional school districts. So from the elementary schools up through the high schools. So, and there's opportunities for teachers to also take advantage of, we offer mini grants to help with science in the classroom, and those are offered in the spring and fall. So we encourage teachers to look at that on the website and take advantage of those programs. And then in the email that went out with the invitation with the Zoom link, Scotty Mobley, our administrator, also talked about the opportunity to connect scientists and teachers. So there's links there. If you're a scientist that wants to reach out and interact with a classroom or vice versa, there's an opportunity there to follow those links and sign up for that, and we can make that connection. So I represent MBL on the WHSTEP board. So I'm very happy that today's speaker is the director of MBL, Nipam Patel. And I have a whole new appreciation for butterflies since Nipam has come to the MBL. And so we'll start the talk. And I'm going to ask everybody if they don't mind staying muted during the talk unless prompted by Nipam to unmute. And then we can have a question and answer session following the presentation. I'll keep an eye on the chat room if there's anything there, and I can relay that as well. So I'm going to hand things over to Nipam and let him have the show.
Thanks very much. So thanks everyone for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure to connect with everyone. Let me go ahead and set up my screen share real quick. Okay, we should be good there. So if you have a question and want to interrupt, please go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself and to interrupt. But as my title implies, I'm going to tell you a little bit about butterflies. And it may seem strange that the director of the MBL works on butterflies, but it's a hobby. Well, I started off as a hobby. So I found a dead butterfly in my yard when I was 8 years old, growing up in Texas. And I learned how to mount the butterfly, and I got really fascinated ever since. But I think you'll all agree that butterflies are a good example of a really charismatic insect, an insect that really appeals to us. A lot of times people are afraid of insects or don't like them, but most everyone thinks that butterflies are pretty attractive. And what makes them attractive, of course, is the adult wing colors and patterns that they have. And this slide just illustrates a little bit of diversity of butterflies. And you can see some of these amazing colors and patterns. But you could ask, of course, what are all these colors and patterns for? Sometimes they're to attract mates. So the butterflies, have these colors so that they can find each other. But they actually also often serve very important protective functions for the butterfly. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that before I dive into a little bit more of a detailed explanation of how they get their colors, especially the blue and green that you see in some butterflies. So butterflies use the patterns on their wings in a variety of ways to protect themselves from predators. Now, the primary predator for butterflies and moths are things like birds, lizards, and spiders, bats as well, especially for moths. So there are a variety of ways that butterflies and moths use the patterns on their wings to give them protection. A pretty obvious one that you'll all pick up on is camouflage, or what we would call cryptic coloration, to blend into the background. So here's a very good example. This is called an EO moth. It actually lives around here if you're lucky enough to see it. So when it sits on the tree bark, you can see how the pattern of its wings helps to break up the outline and for it to meld right into the tree bark and make itself invisible. My favorite example actually comes from this butterfly here called the deadleaf butterfly, which is found in Southeast Asia. And so you can see that on the underside, the butterfly looks for all the world like a dead leaf, even to the point where it has what look like the veins of leaves and little moldy spots on the wing. Now it's very brightly colored actually on the other side, but the underside looks exactly like a dead leaf. And if you collect a bunch of these butterflies, these are all collected in one location in China. What you can see is that even though it's a single species, there's lots of variation between individuals, so that a bird or a lizard can't ever learn a specific pattern that is this butterfly. Instead, it can look like any of the variety of leaves that are around. Now, the butterflies don't actually sit in trees to look like dead leaves, right? So if you think about it, dead leaves are not in trees really, they're on the ground. And so these kinds of butterflies with these dead leaf patterns often sit on the ground. This one is a picture I took in Australia of a dead leaf type of butterfly. And it does another interesting thing, that it also leans into the sun so it doesn't cast a shadow. So it really tries to make itself blend into the leaf background. Another way they protect themselves is something that maybe isn't so obvious until you see certain butterflies, and it's called flash and dazzle. So here's a good example of this. This is a butterfly called the blue morpho, and it's this brilliant metallic blue color, at least the males are. And so you might be lucky enough to have been in Mexico or South America where these butterflies live, and they're extremely visible butterflies with this bright, bright metallic blue. But the underside, they're this cryptically colored brown, this sort of camouflage brown color. So what happens is the butterfly can actually use this bright blue to its advantage to evade predators. So what will happen is when the butterfly is being chased, it'll be flashing that bright blue color. And so the predator will fixate on those bright blue flashes, and then the butterfly will suddenly sit down on the ground and just meld into the color of the ground, the sort of brown earth tones. And so you'll be, if it happens to be you trying to catch the butterfly, you keep looking for this bright blue flash, and you walk right by the butterfly, which is now just sitting on the ground. Another way that butterflies protect themselves is to use patterns on the wing to deflect attacks away from the body. And this works because a butterfly can actually fly reasonably well with a reasonable chunk of its wings missing, especially the hind wings. So here's a good example. These are little hair streak butterflies, and these are actually, again, common around here. So they're a relatively small butterfly. They sit down, and when they sit down, they hold their antenna perfectly still, but they move their hind wings, and they have these sort of fake eye spots and these little fake antennae that are part of their wing. So they move their hind wing up and down. And a predator actually thinks that this is the head end of the butterfly. And so when it attacks it, it attacks right here. So what happens to the butterfly is it loses that little piece of the wing, but it doesn't really bother the butterfly very much. The butterfly can still fly perfectly fine. So it lives another day, which is important because the adults have to find each other to mate. And in this case, this butterfly even has one more spare set of fake antennae here, may use again one more time to ward off an attack. Sometimes this gets carried away. In the tropics, you get these butterflies with these really elaborate tails on them. So in some of the areas of the tropics, the predators have learned to watch the direction the butterfly flies and figures that, that it can tell the head because of that. But butterflies like this actually roll, they turn 180 degrees in the air and land backwards and then run backwards. So they really try to fool the predator into thinking that this is the head end. And so if they get attacked here again, they can survive that and fly away. Another protection they use, which is very interesting, is they use their color patterns sometimes to startle the predator. One of the most famous examples of that come from these butterflies called owl butterflies. So they have these giant eye spots on them. And if you look at these eye spots look like the eyes of a much larger animal. So they're called owl butterflies because the idea is that these eye spots on the butterfly look like the eyes of an owl. So you can imagine if you're a small lizard, you're looking for a butterfly and you suddenly see these big eyes, right? You might be scared because, in fact, this could be an owl that would eat you instead. And so the lizard will hesitate and now give the butterfly just enough time to fly away and escape being eaten. I showed you before that image of the moth that blends into the bark. And here you see that again. But if you startle this moth, it lifts up those hind wings and it has these big eye spot patterns that it shows. And again, the idea is that it can startle the predator for a second, giving the moth, in this case, just a bit of time to fly away. Finally, some butterflies actually, when they're larvae, when they're caterpillars, they eat toxic plants. And so they contain poisons that would make a bird or a lizard sick. But then they advertise this by being very brightly colored. Now, probably the most famous example, one that you all are probably familiar with, are monarch butterflies, which you see around here in the cave. So these butterflies are this, again, this very beautiful orange and black color. They're very easy to see, but this is a warning color to birds and lizards that in fact these butterflies are toxic. So if a bird were to try to bite this butterfly, the toxin would cause the bird to throw up. And so then the bird would say, well, I'm never going to try eating that again. That made me sick. And so the butterflies gain protection in this way. So quite a number of butterflies do this. This is another famous example. These are called heliconius butterflies that live in South America. And again, most of them are these beautiful black butterflies with bright red and yellow and blue and other colors like that. And they basically use those colors to warn away predators. Now, sometimes when you get a poisonous butterfly like this, you'll have something called mimicry. You'll have butterflies that can be eaten, are totally tasty, but in fact, they mimic or look like the poisonous butterflies so that the birds and lizards will leave them alone. So again, this is called mimicry. And again, there's a very good example with the monarch. So this is the monarch butterfly, which would make a bird sick if it ate it. This is a butterfly called the viceroy, which looks just like this monarch. And so the viceroy gains protection by being a mimic of the monarch. This actually is very common throughout the world. So this top row of butterflies are all butterflies that are like monarchs. They eat plants like milkweed plants and they're toxic. But these butterflies are all butterflies that are perfectly edible. The birds would find them tasty, but they look like the poisonous butterflies, so the birds avoid them. Here's some more examples. This one's an interesting one because now the top row are all butterflies that are toxic, and birds would find them distasteful. The bottom row are actually all moths that are also untasteful to birds. So the birds would also find them really, really gross to eat. But you can see that they mimic the butterflies, or the butterflies they mimic each other. So both gain an advantage by doing that. So the bird learns one of these patterns. It doesn't have to try both this butterfly and this moth to know they're unpalatable. Once it eats one of them, it avoids the other as well. So it saves a lot of trouble for the bird to have to learn the patterns, and it saves a lot of lives for the butterflies and moths. Well, I'll switch over now to telling you a little bit about how you actually get color on the wings. So you all are probably used to being told not to touch the wings of a butterfly, okay? And if you do, what looks like dust comes off on your wing, and that dust has the color of the wings. The reason for that is that butterfly wings are covered in what are called scales. And these scales are very, very tiny, and they are what cause the color on the wing. So this is a magnified view of this little area of the wing, and you see these individual scales. So what are scales? So scales are on the adult wing are actually not alive anymore. They're dead. That's one reason the butterfly can't regrow those patterns. If you rub the scales off, they won't grow back because they're not alive anymore. They were alive when it was a chrysalis, when it was the little pupae. That's when these scales grew. And they're really quite large for a cell. So I'll show you on the next slide a little bit about how big they are. Here's another image of them. You see them, they're stuck in the wing by a little socket on them, and then the scale sticks out. So this is the size of a scale. So, we often measure things relative to human hair. That seems to be very popular. It's a little odd because hair is kind of variable in its thickness, but a hair is roughly what we would call 80 microns in diameter. And so a scale is about 300 microns by about 50 microns. So the width of a scale is a little bit less than a human hair. So it gives you some idea of how small these scales are. And so these scales cover the surface of the wing. And each scale is an individual color. And so it's that mosaic tile of color then that gives all the nice, beautiful color and pattern to the wing. So the head of the scales have their color. So these individual scales, the ones that you see here at least that are white and black, and brown and yellow and orange and those kinds of colors, they're filled with pigments. So you might be familiar with pigments as things that you think of as dyes. They're what are in crayons and they dye your clothing and things like that. And it turns out that pigments are used to make colors like red and yellow and orange and brown. what we would call this side of the rainbow, the long side of the rainbow, the yellows, the oranges, the reds, those are made by pigments. But what really are pigments? So pigments are individual molecules that absorb light in a particular way. Think about a yellow highlighter, right? So you've got a yellow highlighter, you mark it on the paper. Why does it look yellow? It looks yellow because this is the chemical that's inside that yellow highlighter. Now, you don't need to worry about this structure, but the important thing about this particular chemical is that it's very good at absorbing blue light. And so if you have light that's a balance of blue, red, and green shining down on this, it absorbs the blue light, and what's reflected is red and green, and you perceive that as a yellow color. And so that's how you get pigment colors, by having molecules that absorb a particular wavelength of light and then give you a color. But it turns out that it's very hard to have pigments that give you green and blue color. So these would be pigments that essentially absorb red light. Now there's one big exception to that, and that's the molecule called chlorophyll that makes plants green. It's very good at absorbing red light, and it's why the world is so green. But it turns out that most living things are not very good at making blue and green color using pigments. And this isn't true for just butterflies. It's true in other cases. So if you see like the beautiful iridescent blue and green of a bird feather, right? That's not a pigment. It's a phenomenon that I'm going to describe to you in a minute called structural coloration. The same is true like for the skin of a blue monkey or the blue scales on a fish, or even human blue eyes. So if you have blue eyes, you actually don't have any blue pigment in your eye. And instead, it's a phenomenon known as structural color. So how does structural color work if it's not a pigment? I think the best way to think about this is to think about a soap bubble. So you've all seen soap bubbles, and when a soap bubble is in the sun, you can see all the colors of the rainbow in the soap bubble. But how is that? Because the soap itself has no color. So why does the bubble have all the colors of the rainbow? And it turns out it's an interesting phenomenon. When light interacts with an incredibly thin material, you can get a phenomenon known as structural coloration. So what happens is light, and that's shown by this arrow here, when it hits a very thin material, you can get a reflection off of the top surface of that material and a reflection off the bottom surface. So if you think of a soap bubble, it's got a thin film of soap, and light is reflecting off of both the top and the bottom of that thin layer of soap that makes the bubble. But light also behaves as waves. And so these waves can do interesting things when they come back together from reflecting off the top and the bottom. So if the waves are in step with one another, right? So you can think of like waves in the ocean. If they're in step with one another, when they hit each other, they'll double their size, okay? And if that happens to a particular wave, it looks, and light behaves as a wave, it'll look much brighter. If those waves are out of step with one another, they cancel each other out and they would seem to disappear. Well, it turns out that white light, if you shine it through a prism, right, you'll see the whole rainbow of color. Each of those colors is made of light with different wavelengths, so different distances between the troughs and the peaks of the wave. And so when white light interacts with a thin material like a soap bubble, some of the colors will get reinforced and some of the colors will get destroyed. Okay, and now I'll give you then a color, in this case, like the color of the soap bubble that you see, this rainbow effect. All right. But if you tune it just right and have a consistent thickness, you can get a very precise color. So how thick does this material have to be to do this? Well, it has to be incredibly thin. So if you remember that your hair is about 80 microns, but it turns out, or it's about 0.08 millimeters, but it turns out that like the wavelength of light is 0.0006 millimeters. So orders of magnitude smaller. And the material has to be on that kind of thickness in order for this phenomena to occur. But it turns out butterflies can really make this kind of material quite well. So the next example I'm going to show you is a moth, but the only pigment color in the moth is black. And all the other colors you see on the moth are created by this phenomenon known as structural coloration. So it's the way the light interacts with the very thin material that makes the scale. And so you see this moth has all the colors of the rainbow. It's called a sunset moth. You get all these gorgeous colors, these blues and greens and yellows and oranges and purples, but none of it's pigment. It's all because the scales have very thin layers of a material called chitin. That's the exoskeleton material that all insects and lobsters and other arthropods are made of. But in these scales, it's fashioned so it's very, very thin and it interacts with this light in this way. And by having different thicknesses of this material, you can actually get all the different colors of the rainbow. I showed you that example of those brilliant blue morphos, right, with that beautiful blue color. Again, there's no blue pigment in this wing. And instead, these scales just have these minute structures on them, which causes phenomena of light, which gives a blue color. One way we can show this is that we can play around a little bit with the material properties of what these scales are made of. And in this case, you see the nice blue morpho butterfly, and I'm about to drop a drop of acetone onto the wing. And the acetone, what it's going to do is going to change the way light interacts with the wing, and you're going to see that now the wing is this beautiful green color instead. So what do these scales have that causes the light to do this? So if you magnify in on the scales, here you see them over the wing. If you magnify even more, you'll see that these scales have these ridges on them that run along the length of the scale. Now, all scales have ridges, but if you cut across this, so we're going to section this way and zoom in even more, what you see is that these ridges, when you look on in, look like Christmas trees. But these are incredibly tiny Christmas trees. A single bacteria would be the whole size of one of these things. So these are very small, but they interact with light. They're spaced just right so that when white light hits, the only light that leaves is blue light. And it looks really, really bright because those blue waves are all combined together to make them really bright. And so you see that as this brilliant blue color. Now, one of the things that happens, we put that acetone on the wing, but if we just let the acetone, and acetone is fingernail polish remover, if we just let that evaporate away, you'll see the wing goes right back to being blue as air goes back into those spaces. So one of the things that we're doing in our lab is trying to understand how the butterflies build these kinds of things, how they build these kinds of structures. So one of the first things we wanted to do was to be able to watch wings growing in live pupae or a chrysalis. So this is a chrysalis of one of these butterflies called the buckeye. And these butterflies do live around here in Cape Cod. You might see them in the later part of the summer. But normally when you have a chrysalis, you can't see into it. But we've developed methods that allow us to see into it. So the butterfly is a chrysalis for about 8 days. And you see now you can see the wing developing inside during the course of the 8 days. The wing has veins in it, and now the scales are starting to grow. And right at the end of the movie, you'll see actually all of the colors come in, the pigment colors. And you see all that nice color come in into the wing. So we can grow the butterflies now so that we can see it and watch the wings developing. And with these butterflies, these brown buckeye butterflies, we've been investigating some of the genes that are responsible for creating the blue color. And in fact, we can do genetic manipulations to make the butterfly this bright iridescent blue. So this is the normal butterfly. And we can actually do a trick called genetic editing, and we can mutate a gene which now causes the butterfly to be blue. So we begin to understand how it is that it can make blue scales. And I'll just finish by telling you one other kind of butterfly color we're studying. Well, not so much a color, but transparency. So in the tropics, you often find butterflies that are amazingly clear. So they're transparent like this butterfly. So you actually see straight through the butterfly to whatever's in the background. So this is a great way to be camouflaged, right? You can essentially be invisible. And these wings can be really beautifully transparent. So many butterflies and moths have evolved transparency. So these are just some scattered species in the tree of butterflies where they've actually evolved transparency. So how do they get transparent? Well, they have to get the scales out of the way. So they do all sorts of things, like they turn the scales into little bristles, so they're much, much finer. So now the light can go through the wing, or they can turn the scales vertically, or they do a variety of tricks so that the scales aren't in the way. And now the light can go through the wing and the wing can be transparent. But you might notice some of them are better at being transparent than others. So like this butterfly here, down here, the Godiris is a great example of a butterfly that's really super transparent. And so even light that's shining straight down onto it doesn't reflect off of the surface and you see right through. But this butterfly is kind of transparent, but you can see that it gets glare. And so if it's in bright light, you can still see it. Well, you might experience this problem if you wear glasses. So you can have glasses that glare. So if you're in the bright sunlight, you see reflections on them. But some of you may know that you can buy glasses that have an anti-glare coating on them. And then even when the light's shining on them, you don't get any glare. And so as humans, we think we're really smart because we figured out how to do this. But butterflies figured this out a long time ago. So these butterfly wings that are exceptionally clear, if you zoom in on the wing, again, you see that instead of the normal scales covering the wing, they've transformed the scales into these really fine little hair-like structures. So now light can go through. But again, now normally light would also glare off of this surface. But if you zoom in even further, they've actually put an anti-glare coating, these very tiny little particles, all over the surface of their wings so they don't get glare. And so this is something else that we're starting to study is how these butterflies make this anti-glare coating. And I'll end there and just thank all the people that were involved in this work and a funding agency called the Human Frontier Science Program for their support. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So there's a question in the chat room that says, asking, how do the birds and lizards learn about the poisonous butterflies?
Yeah, so they have to experience it one time in order to sort of learn it. So you'll see a juvenile bird will taste something like a monarch, and then the first thing you'll do is throw up when it tries to eat it. It's actually kind of a cardiac poison, but they rarely eat enough to kill them, but they eat enough to make them sick. So while we might think that birds and lizards are not that intelligent, they're intelligent enough to learn that if they eat something that makes them really sick, they're not going to eat it again. So that's what they do. And over time, birds and lizards have learned to generally avoid really, really brightly colored things like the orange and black butterflies. And so there's a little bit of that, but mostly they do it by a single trial learning. If they try it one time, it makes them really sick, and they say, I'm never going to try that again.
There's another question in the chat room. Are there any regenerative abilities with those butterflies that have a piece taken out of them?
No, there's not. So there are some parts of the wing that are alive, but most of the wing isn't alive. And so what happens when you take cut a piece of wing, it's not going to grow back. And so the butterfly is just going to have to live with that. But one thing everyone has to remember is that the butterfly that you see flying is just one phase of its life cycle. And so most adult butterflies don't actually live very long. They usually live a week or two, just long enough to mate and lay eggs and start a next generation. And they spend most of their life as caterpillars. And so if a butterfly misses a part of its wing and it can't fly, maybe not quite as well, it doesn't really need to regenerate the wing. It will live long enough to go ahead and mate and lay eggs, and that will be fine for passing on the next generation.
Another question from the chat room is, how about the wings of other insects, like transparent wings of the brood X cicadas? Do the same principles apply?
Yeah, they sort of apply. I mean, so butterflies and moths belong to a group of insects that we call Lepidoptera, which means they have scaly wings. But in fact, most insects don't have scales on their wings. So cicadas are an example of an insect that never did have scales on its wings. So it's always had transparent wings like dragonflies. And so, but cicadas don't actually worry about the reflection on their wings. So if you actually look at one of these cicadas that's coming out in bright sunlight, the wings glare pretty badly. So they don't bother putting an anti-glare coating. And that's because mostly they spend their time in the shadows of the leaves on the trees. So don't worry about the glare of direct sunlight.
Another question has popped in. What can you say about separating the spring azure complex? I've heard it has to do with the wing scales, but don't know much else about that.
Yeah, I think if I understand the question right, so spring azures are the little blue butterflies that you see flying right now. They're a pretty prominent butterfly in the spring. They actually have one more generation in late summer as well. And You know, they're one of these butterflies where you see little blue butterflies and they're actually really hard to tell apart. And people always thought that spring azures were one species. And I think this question is alluding to the fact that people believe that actually there are multiple species that all look very, very similar to one another and they're hard to tell apart. And so people do think sometimes that you can, you know, examine in great detail the color patterns on the wings. But really, often with butterflies like this, the only way to separate them is by looking at their genitalia, by dissecting their abdomens and looking at very, very fine structures under the microscope. And actually, the butterfly will tell you it's a different species because they won't mate with one another. So if you can set up experiments like that, you can see that they're different species. But if you're just trying to look at them and figure it out, it's not easy. There's a very famous, Novikov, actually, in addition to being a great author, he actually really was interested in butterflies, and he worked in the southwest of the in the west of the United States, where there's lots of these little blue butterflies that fly around in the mountains. And Novikov actually figured out that there were quite a number of different species that people had all lumped together, and he did it by painstakingly dissecting the abdomens of the butterfly and showing that they were different species because they had very, very different reproductive structures.
We got a comment from the classroom that was here that they said thank you, and they learned all about the scales and color from the 4th grade class that attended. They seemed pretty happy to be here. If anyone else has any questions, you can also feel free to unmute yourself or turn your video off, so or turn your video on. Okay, so I think that's all that's come through. I encourage everybody to visit MBL's website. You can learn more about Nipam's research, other research here. Visit the websites of the different institutions that are part of WHSTEP. We all like to share what we do. It's fun for us to share what we do with all of you. So.
Thanks. And I'll say that our buildings aren't open to the public yet, but there'll be a little set of display cases of some of the butterflies once the building Lily is open again. Once that happens, we'll be able to come and see them.
Great. All right. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up then. Thank you for everybody for attending. Thank you, Nipam. That was, like I said, a whole new appreciation for butterflies now when I see them.
So. Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Take care.
Great day.
Okay.